Hi, I'm James Ward, a technical evangelist for Flex at Adobe. So we've just released Flex 4.5, and there's some really great new features in Flex 4.5. A lot of the new features are around mobile application development. And these are really exciting, being able to build mobile applications and tablet applications with Flex. But there's also some really new exciting features for web applications and desktop applications. One of those new features is the new Spark DataGrid. And we've had a DataGrid in Flex for a long time, but the new Spark DataGrid is really great because it allows us to very easily customize the look and feel of the DataGrid control, and it makes it really easy to do that. So I'm going to show you some code to show you how we use the basic DataGrid, and then show you how we create custom skins and do a bunch of other really exciting things with the DataGrid. So let's jump into the code. So here I am in Flash Builder 4.5, and I have a simple project that is just going to go out and get some data via AMF from my server, and then render that data into the DataGrid. So I'm getting 500 rows, and then my DataGrid's data provider is set to bind to the last result from getting this data. So this is the new Spark DataGrid, so you'll notice that it's s:/DataGrid. It's in the Spark package. So now let's just run this application and see what the new Spark DataGrid looks like. So here we are, we're running that and fetching that data from the server, and there we go. So it automatically figured out what the column should be in the DataGrid and has pulled in that data and rendered it. And so you can see the performance here is really great. We can scroll up and down on this DataGrid. We can scroll all the way down to the bottom, see all 500 rows. And so it's just a really great out-of-the-box control for rendering data. But there's some really cool things we can do with really changing the look and feel of this to make it seem to fit in better with your UI. So what we can do is create a new custom skin for this DataGrid. So what I can do is just come in and type skin class here in the DataGrid, and now I can create a new skin. And so when I create a new skin, it's going to ask me for the name. I'm going to make it my skin. And then I'm going to tell it that the host component is the DataGrid, that's just the default, and I'm going to create a copy of the DataGrid skin. So this will set me up with just the default Spark DataGrid skin as a basis, and then allow me to start making changes to the look and feel. So here in my skin, we have a bunch of code that really is just going through and describing all the different pieces of the DataGrid and what they should look like. So for instance, here's a column separator, and then we have a hover indicator, and all these things are just describing how this thing should be drawn. Down at the bottom, we kind of have the guts of the visual display of the DataGrid. So we've got the grid column header group. We have background colors. Then we actually have a scroller that allows this DataGrid to be scrolled. And then we have the grid that's actually displaying the data. So this is the visual representation of this component. And now we can come in and start actually tweaking some things. So the first one that let's tweak here is this hover indicator. So this is the default hover indicator. It's going to use the roll over color style. I'm just going to go and replace this with just a standard rectangle and give the standard rectangle a fill with a color of red. So 0xFF0000. And so now when we save this, it's going to be using this skin for this DataGrid now, so because I'm specifying the skin class to be my skin. So now let's go just refresh this DataGrid application, and what we'll see here is that now my hover color is that red. So that's how easy it is to actually begin totally customizing the entire look and feel of this DataGrid. So now let's go see some other cool things we can do with the DataGrid. So that's just our plain old DataGrid. We can also, of course, explicitly set our columns. So here we're actually setting the columns property on this DataGrid to be an array list of the columns that we want to display. So for instance, we didn't want to display one of these columns, or we want to set some explicit widths of the columns. We can do that here. So let me show you this one. Let's run this one. So in this one, you'll see that I've specified an ordering of the columns as well as some minimum widths. And so now when we see this one running, you'll see that it's ordered these more logically, and when I try to resize these, it's going to not allow me to resize these past the size. So that the ID one, I didn't specify a minimum width on, but the age one I did. The minimum width on age is 45, so the DataGrid's just automatically not going to let me resize this column smaller than 45. There's a lot of other properties that we can specify to really control the behavior of our columns in the DataGrid. Now the next thing I want to show you is some ways that we can control sizing of the DataGrid. So in this one, it's like what we've seen before, but this time I have 3 DataGrids, and I'm telling each of these that they have a requested row count. And so this is a new property on the Spark DataGrid that allows me to control kind of the minimum number of columns or rows that we want to display. So for the first one, I'm telling it that I'd like it to display 5 rows, second one 7 rows, third one 9 rows. And so now when we run this one, we should see 3 DataGrids, all of different heights, because they're each requesting a different number of rows to display. So there you'll see the first one, 5 rows, then 7 rows, then 9 rows. And then another new feature here is the horizontal scrolling is a lot nicer now in the new Spark DataGrid. So as I scroll left and right, because I didn't have enough room to display all these columns, it's a really nice experience there with the scroll bar sticking to the right edge. So that's one of the other new features there in the DataGrid. And let me show you now custom renderers. So custom renderers, this is the ability to take a column and specify a custom way of rendering the data in that column. So if we take a look here on the age column, what I'm doing is I have a custom item render for this column, and I'm telling it really just draw a rectangle and make the size of that rectangle dependent on the person's age. I guess if someone's over 100, then that probably won't work well, so I might need to tweak my logic a little bit. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But let's run this one and see what this looks like now with the custom render on the age column. So in this one, instead of just rendering text for age, you'll see that now I have this nice little blue rectangle that's indicating the age in a more visual way. And so we can use these custom grid item renders to really control the complete way that each item in a column is rendered. And what I'm doing in this one is I'm actually using data binding to bind to the data value there that I want to control the rendering. But there's another way to do this as well. And so with this one, I have the same grid item renderer, but now I'm overriding this prepare method where I'm actually setting that same value, but doing it now without data binding. And so this will work the same way, but will actually perform quite a bit better because we don't have to have the overhead of the events associated with data binding and those sorts of things. And we could do some dirty value checking to really make this perform well. So of course when I run this one, it should look the same way now, but is using the prepare method instead of data binding. So there we go. So I want to show you one more thing that's pretty exciting about the new DataGrid, and this is data paging. So the new Spark DataGrid and all the actual Spark list controls now support the ability to do data paging. And so what this means is that instead of having to pull over all of the data you want to display in a DataGrid at one time, you can pull it over incrementally as the user needs to see it. So I have a project here for data paging, and this one's a little bit more complex of implementation. There's a lot of things I have to control. I have to control when do I want to go fetch a new page, what's my page size, and has a page already been fetched. And so what I've done is I've created a class here that really helps me to track all that. And then I have a new collection here, the paged list, that is really tracking whether or not data has been loaded. And so let me just show you this one so you can get an idea for what it is. Really not a whole lot of data here to be able to do data paging, and really not a lot of code to be able to do data paging. So here we go. I've run this and it's loaded the first page of data. So the first page of data is loaded in here, and as I scroll down, you'll see that once I got past 100, it loaded in another page. So there was a small flicker as I went to a new page and it had to load a new page of information. So there's actually 100,000 items here in the data grid, but only at this point 3 pages of that data has been loaded, so 300 items. So it's a lot less network transfer data. And now as I grab this thumb and I start to scroll down, you'll see that as soon as I pause on a section for a little bit, it'll go and fetch that page. And it doesn't actually even have to fetch all the pages between the top and the bottom. It's just fetching the data for where I stop in the data grid. And so I can go down to all the way to the bottom, all the way to 100,000, and see that it's loaded in that page of data, but didn't have to actually load in all 100,000 items. So this is a great new feature of all the list-based controls in Flex 4.5 and Spark, is the ability to add data paging into them. So that's a quick overview of the new data grid in Flex 4.5. Hope you build some great new applications with it, and head on over to the Adobe Developer Connection for more information. Thanks.